I'm Miss Osuna, and I'm so excited today to teach you how to do a binding. A binding is really a trim that is wrapped around and sewn onto a raw edge of fabric. So for example, with the dress that I'm wearing, my neckline is actually a binding that is sewn around the raw edge of my neckline. Having said that, there are many different types of bindings, and they can be quite complicated. So this one is the easiest one that I could think of to start you off with. So I have a plan. My plan is, if I show you the easiest one first, then I can hook you so that you'll be curious and motivated to investigate how to do the more complicated versions. Bindings can take your clothing from beginning to professional looking with just a little bit of practice. So let's go on ahead and get started. Okay, so I have two pieces of fabric here set up at my ironing station. I have this piece, which is my binding. It's 4 inches high. So that's the height. And then the length from left side to the right side is whatever length of the item you are actually binding. And then this is my pocket. So I'm going to press them both, giving it some steam so that I'm starting off with a good amount of steam in the iron, water in the iron, and that my fabric is nice and straight from the beginning. Now I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to fold it in half horizontally and press. So here I've folded it in half horizontally and I'm just going to press. So what we have created now is a 2-inch high binding. So it started at 4 inches high. I folded it in half horizontally and pressed it, and now it's 2 inches high. You have a folded edge now at the top, and then here we have 2 raw edges at the bottom. So our next step is to draw our sewing line. So what I'm going to do is turn it upside down. Notice that my open edges are at the top, my folded edge or the closed edge is at the bottom, and then I'm going to lay it down on the table and draw, because we want to sew at the top edge here where it's open. So I have a clear ruler. This is what we recommend and what we use as fashion designers because you can see through it. I'm going to line it up on the 1/2 of an inch spot, and I have a water-soluble pen, and I'm going to draw this in. Now I'm not going to draw it too hard because I don't want it to show up too much, but it will come out with water and then a rag, but I don't want to have to scrub too hard to get it out, so I'm just not going to press that hard. So now at my open edge, or the raw edge, I have drawn in 1/2 of an inch down, and the line is there so that I can sew on top of it. That'll make it easier. Notice again that fold is at the bottom, my open edges are at the top, and I've drawn in at the top edge here 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So that's just the sewing line. And I used a water-soluble pencil. It will come out if I just have some water on a rag and just scrub at it, but I didn't push too hard, so it should be very, very easy to wipe away when I'm ready to do that. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, now that I have pressed my binding, and I've drawn in my sewing line, I'm just going to place it on my pocket. So here is where I'm going to put this onto my pocket. Notice the other way, it doesn't fit. So this is actually the wrong edge. So I'm finding the edge that it fits onto. And my pocket is just a rectangle, very simple, and I'm gonna put it at the top edge. And next I'm going to pin. So when I'm putting the pins in place, I'm going to take a pin with a ball at the top, easier to grab. I'm gonna poke through to the back, and I'm about 1/4 of an inch down from the top. And after I've poked through, I'm gonna push it back to the front and keep the ball of the pin very high out of the way. I'm going to do another pin closer to the far right side. So here I have the pin, push it through. I'm about 1/4 inch down from the top edge and push back to the front. So you need to make sure that your pins go all the way through to the back side and then come back out on the front. So now I'm going to put another pin toward the center. So I typically start left side, right side, and then I go to the center. I'm just going to repeat, push it through to the back, bring it back to the front. Now notice these pins are going opposite of the sewing line. So I will do a pin the wrong way just to emphasize this point. If I put the pin this way, that pin right in the middle is going the same way as the sewing line. That's completely incorrect. You always want your pin to be perpendicular or opposite of the sewing line. So I'm going to fix that, push it in to the back, bring it to the front, and the ball of the pin always stays very high out of the way of our sewing machine and our sewing line. All right, let's continue. Okay, now I am at the sewing machine. I have my entire sewing piece and it is pinned. My sewing line is in place. I have the pins at the very top, far out of the way so that I don't run over them. Now I'm gonna turn towards the right. So that was once again turning towards the right in a clockwise direction. And now I'm going to place this under the presser foot. My machine is already set up for a straight stitch, so make sure that's the case for you. Once your machine is set up for a straight stitch, turn the wheel towards you to check by hand. So towards you, and you're looking at the needle. You want it to line up on the sewing line. Then you'll lower your presser foot very gently. Once you are completely in line, grab that foot pedal, making sure that you can reach it comfortably, and then you are going to sew forward and then backward to create a back stitch. So I'm going to sew forward 2 stitches and then back. My left hand is on the top of the machine. My right hand, I have fingers underneath the fabric and thumb on top to hold. Now I'm stepping on the presser foot. Now I'm stepping on the foot pedal. That was 2 stitches forward. Now I'm going to push this up and hold it to go backward. 2 stitches backward is all you need for a back stitch. That's it. I'm going to let that go. Fingers under, thumb on top. That's my right hand. Left hand is on top just to guide the fabric through. And I'm going to continue sewing. My eye the entire time is right on that sewing line. I want to make sure the needle lands on my sewing line every single time. Gently step on that foot pedal. Remember, it's not a race. And because we have the ball of our pin to the right, our pins are the opposite way of our sewing line. They're perpendicular to the sewing line. we can sew right across the entire pin. Notice the change of position. Once I got about 3/4 of the way finished, I moved my hand to the top. So my right hand is now on top of the fabric just to guide it with 2 fingers. As I'm getting closer to the end, I'm going to get ready, once I get here, for a back stitch. Notice now I have 1 finger on top. All right, so now I am truly ready for a back stitch because I'm already at the very end. So I'm going to lift it and hold it, stitch 2 stitches backward. I'm going to let it go, and then I'm going to stitch forward. Done. Now notice, my needle is down. So I take my right hand, turn the wheel towards me, always towards you, until the needle is in the highest position. Once the needle's in the very highest position, you are going to lift that presser foot lever and pull a very long tail. This is important because the needle is very easy to come undone. So here I'm going to cut at the very end where I finished, and then I'm going to go back and cut at the very beginning where I started sewing. So I've just sewn. I put a back stitch on the beginning and end of my stitch for security, and I followed my sewing line. Next, we're going to take out our pins and we are going to press. Okay, so now I'm at my sewing station. This is my seam. And now I'm going to press on top of it, giving it a lot of steam on the front side and on the back. And that's key. Pressing the front and the back of your sewing is how you begin to melt the fabric with your thread. So that's the first step, pressing the front and the back of the seam. Next, I'm going to press by pushing the sewing of our binding upward. So here is the right side, here's the wrong side. So I can see my binding here. I have the wrong side facing the table. Notice that my table has a little cushion so that when I iron, that cushion stays under it. This is just gray fabric that I folded a few layers. You can use a towel as well. Now I'm going to push the binding upward as high as it'll go and press. So I'm holding it with my hand and pressing. I want to make sure this stays in position. That was why I held it with my hand. So that next step here now, after we pressed it the first time flat, was to press with the binding going up. Now if I turn it over, you can see that seam allowance is up, and that's what we want. And now we're ready to press again. We are simply going to take this folded edge. We need that exact seam allowance to stay, so we're not going to trim it away. We're going to simply fold right on top of that seam allowance. Now this is finger pressing when you just take your hand and smoothly press against the fabric. So that's what I did first, and then I'm going to hold everything in position, making sure my threads are all tucked away so we don't see them. And I am simply going to press, and then I'm going to give it some steam. So this is my third time pressing. Lots of steam, and I'm pressing here on the front, and I'm going to turn it over and press on the back as well. Everything has now been pressed in place, and this is what it looks like. We have our folded edge that wraps around, and it's going to cover the entire seam. All that's left to do now is to sew it down. Some people will want to put pins, and that's great. I highly recommend it, especially if you're a beginner. So I'll do that. First pin, just as I always do, toward the left side. Push it through to the back, bring it into the front. It goes through all the layers. Keep the ball of the pin out of the way. Second pin towards the right side. Push it all the way through to the back. Bring it all the way to the front. Keep the ball of the pin out of the way. Remember, always pin in the opposite direction of the sewing line. Third pin will go in the center and we will be ready. Push through to the back. Push back through to the front. Keeping the ball of the pin very, very high out of the way. And now we're simply going to sew very close to this edge here. That's our folded edge, and that will be the finish of our binding for our pocket. Okay, now we are back at the sewing machine. Our fabric has been sewn with the binding to it. So in my case, I have a black pocket and a brown binding. It's pinned in place. We're going to turn it once again to the right. I'll do that one more time. Turn it to the right. That's clockwise. Now, place it under the presser foot. We are going to sew the very edge, that folded edge, down. When I say that folded edge, remember this was a fold from the very beginning that we made in our binding. We're going to sew close to that edge. So we're placing it under the presser foot. And we are lowering the presser foot lever. Turn the wheel towards you, always towards you. Needle goes down. That holds everything in place and it stops the thread from coming out of the needle. Remember, my left hand is on top of the machine at the throat plate. This silver is our throat plate. So my left hand is up top, on top of the fabric to guide. Right hand, fingers go under, thumb goes on top. Get ready, make sure your thread is to the back of the machine. Stitch 2 stitches forward. And now let go with the right hand. Do your reverse button and stitch 2 stitches backward. Let that go and now continue sewing down the entire binding folded edge. You just want to go nice and slowly. As you're sewing, you can change your position. I'm about halfway, so instead of holding this way the entire time, I'm running out of space here. I'm going to now flip my hand to the top. Sometimes you can even use 2 fingers on top and your thumb underneath. Either way, you just want to keep everything in place, whatever way works best for you. Practice sewing very slowly. That means gently touching the foot pedal. Okay, it's time for a back stitch. That's it. My needle is down. Before you do anything, always check your needle position. Right hand, turning the wheel towards me. Needle goes up to the highest position. Now I can lift the presser foot lever with my left hand. Remember, I'm pulling a long tail. We need distance so that the thread does not come out of the eye of the needle. I'm going to cut right at the end and then go back to the beginning. So I have 2 thread pieces to cut. Remove all of my pins and take a look. You've sewn down your binding. Now, let's press. Okay, now that I have finished my sewing, I'm going to press one more time. As always, press on the front, give it some steam, and flip it over, and press on the back. That concludes the demo for your binding. I hope that you were able to learn something, and I really, really hope to see some of the great things that you sew a binding onto. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with me, Miss Osuna. Until we meet again, please stay well.